My name is Melissa, and I used to believe that hard work would always be rewarded. I believed that if you did your best and stayed honest, you would rise in life. I was so naive. I was working as a marketing assistant at a prestigious firm in the city. I arrived early, stayed late, met all my targets. My colleagues respected me. Some even admired me. But everything changed when John became my new boss. John was a man with a charming face and a rotten soul. He smiled in front of everyone, but behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. He had a reputation that people whispered about, but no one dared to confront. Women left quietly. Men stayed silent. I should have seen the signs, but I wanted to believe I was safe, as long as I stayed professional. The first time he called me to his office late at night, I thought it was for work. He praised me, said I was smart and pretty, and that he saw potential in me. I thanked him awkwardly and tried to leave, but he stood in my way. He asked if I wanted to grow in the company. I said yes. He said then I should make him happy. I froze. He moved closer. I stepped back. I told him I was not comfortable. He smiled, but his eyes were cold. He said I should think carefully, that he could make or break my future. I walked out shaking. That night I cried, not because I was weak, but because I realized the system was broken, and I was stuck in it. The next day I acted like nothing happened. He did too, but the messages began. At first they were subtle, then they got bolder. He would ask me to meet him after work. He would call at night. He would send photos I never wanted to see. I never replied. I kept everything, every message, every voicemail, every word. Then came the punishment. He started removing me from projects, gave my work to others, ignored my emails. My teammates noticed. They asked what happened. I just smiled and said nothing. But my silence only gave him more power. One morning I came to the office and my access card didn't work. Security told me to wait. Minutes later, HR came down and asked me to pack my things. They said I had violated policy, that I had missed deadlines, that there were complaints about my behavior. I laughed. I cried. I begged them to check the records. But they just handed me a termination letter and watched as I was escorted out like a criminal. I stood on the street with a box in my hands and my dignity in pieces. But I was not done. I was not broken. I was just getting started. I went home that day with a fire burning in my chest. I sat on my bed and stared at the ceiling for hours. I replayed every moment, every word, every look from John. I felt humiliated, but deep down, I knew I had something powerful. I had the truth. I opened my laptop and created a folder. I named it Justice. I began organizing everything I had collected. Screenshots of his messages, recordings from voicemails, email trails where he subtly hinted at favors. I backed everything up on multiple drives. I created a timeline. I wrote down every incident with dates and witnesses. I was building a case, a quiet war plan. But I knew that exposing him would not be easy. He was powerful, connected, and men like him knew how to cover their tracks. I needed help. I reached out to an old college friend named Rachel. She was now a journalist known for exposing corruption. We met in a quiet coffee shop. I told her everything. I showed her the files. She listened without saying a word. When I was done, she looked at me with wide eyes and said, "This is bigger than I thought." She promised to help, but warned me that once the story goes public, there would be backlash. I told her I was ready. I had already lost everything. What more could they take from me? She started digging into the company, into John's past. What she found made me sick. I was not the first. There were others, too many. Some had resigned silently. Others were paid to stay quiet. And some just vanished from the industry. Rachel reached out to them. At first, no one wanted to talk. Fear had silenced them. But slowly, one by one, they opened up. Their stories matched mine. Almost word for word. The compliments, the invitations, the threats, the silence. Rachel gathered their statements and began writing the article. In the meantime, I applied for jobs. Rejected. Overqualified. Underqualified. No response. My name was tainted. John had made sure of that. But I did not stop. I started a blog. Anonymous at first. I wrote about toxic workplaces, about women who were forced to choose between their careers and their dignity. My words reached people. Thousands read them. Some wrote back with their own stories. I was building an army without even knowing it. Weeks passed. Then months. Rachel said the article would be ready soon. But she needed more. Something direct. Something from within the company. So I called someone I used to trust. Her name was Clara. She still worked there. I told her everything. She hesitated. She was scared. But eventually she agreed to help. She started forwarding internal memos, meeting notes, HR complaints that had been buried. Everything pointed to one man, John. He was not just targeting me. He was a serial predator. And he had been protected for years by silence and fear. I felt rage. But I also felt power. I was not a victim anymore. I was a weapon. Rachel told me the article was going live in 3 days. I could barely sleep. I imagined John's face when he saw it. I imagined the board members scrambling. I imagined every woman he hurt finally feeling seen. But I also knew I had to be ready for war, because men like John do not go down without a fight. The morning the article was published, my phone buzzed. Non-stop. Calls, messages, emails. Some from friends, some from strangers, some from numbers I did not recognize. The headline was bold. Powerful executive accused of harassment and abuse by multiple former employees. My name was in it. So was my face. There was no turning back. Within hours it went viral. People started sharing it, commenting. News outlets picked it up. Other journalists began digging deeper. My blog gained thousands of new readers overnight. More women came forward, some even from other companies where John had worked before. He had a pattern, a long and ugly one. But then came the backlash. His supporters called me a liar, said I was bitter, that I wanted attention, that I was making it all up to ruin a good man's career. Some of the threats were terrifying. I received emails that made my stomach turn. One said I should watch my back. Another said they knew where I lived. I reported them all. But the fear stayed. I installed cameras around my apartment, changed my number, moved in with Rachel for a while. She reminded me that this is what power does when it is threatened. It screams. It scratches. It tries to scare you into silence. But I had been silent long enough. Then something incredible happened. A woman named Olivia contacted me. She said she used to be John's secretary. She had kept copies of everything. Emails, meeting notes, calendar logs, even audio recordings. She said she had been scared, but now she wanted to help. She sent everything to Rachel. What she sent confirmed everything. John had a private office where he invited certain women for personal meetings. There were multiple reports filed to HR that mysteriously disappeared. Olivia had proof that he had paid off 2 women in the past. All of it was now in Rachel's hands. The company tried to release a statement. They said they were conducting an internal investigation, that they took all complaints seriously, but people were not buying it. The pressure grew. Protests started outside the office. People held signs with my name, with other victims' names. We were not invisible anymore. Then finally the news broke. John had been suspended pending investigation. It was not enough, but it was something. I cried that day, not because I was sad, but because I knew I had cracked his armor. For the first time he was afraid, and I was not done yet. John disappeared from the office after the suspension. No emails, no messages, no public statements, just silence. But silence from men like him is never peace. It is planning. It is waiting. It is venom gathering in the dark. I knew he would strike back. I just did not know when or how. Then the lawsuit started. Not from him, from me. and from 6 other women who had found the courage to stand beside me. We filed a joint complaint with evidence that Rachel and Olivia had collected. Our lawyer was fierce and smart and angry. She had spent her entire career fighting cases like this, and she told us one thing from the start: never expect justice to be quick, but never doubt that it can come. The company began to squirm. Their lawyers tried to negotiate, offered settlements, asked for silence. We refused. We did not want money. We wanted the truth. We wanted accountability. We wanted John to stand in front of the world and see what he had built fall apart around him. The media kept digging. More women came forward. Women from 5 years ago, 10 years ago, from other states. His past was rotting, and it was finally visible. But John was not done. One morning, I woke up to find a video had been posted online. Someone had edited old clips from my social media, made it look like I was a party girl, irresponsible, immature. They tried to assassinate my character, but people were smarter now. The comments under the video were brutal. They called it desperate, disgusting. One person wrote she stood against a predator, and you think this will break her. Think again. I smiled when I read that, because the truth was no longer hiding. It was roaring. Rachel published a second article. This one focused on the company's role, how HR had ignored reports, how executives had dismissed concerns, how the culture of silence had protected John and hurt everyone else. Sponsors pulled out, stock prices dropped. The board called for an emergency meeting. Then it happened. A formal apology from the company. A letter signed by the CEO. They admitted to failure, promised to reform their policies, promised to protect whistleblowers, promised training, transparency, accountability, but promises meant nothing to me without action. John was officially fired the next week. Not suspended, fired. His name was removed from the website. His office emptied. His reputation shattered. But I did not celebrate. Not yet, because I knew this was not just about him. It was about every woman who had ever been told to stay quiet, every employee who had ever feared their boss more than they feared losing their job. And I was just getting started. After John was fired, I thought maybe I could finally breathe. But the storm had only shifted direction. Now I was being watched closely by people who had once ignored me. Invitations to speak at conferences started coming. Journalists requested interviews. Advocacy groups reached out. They wanted my voice, my story, my pain wrapped in purpose. I accepted a few offers. I sat on stages with other women who had fought monsters, dressed in suits. I shared my experience in rooms full of strangers who nodded and cried and sometimes stood to applaud. I spoke without fear. Without shame, because shame belonged to the ones who hid behind power, not to those who stood up against it. Rachel suggested I turn my blog into a full platform, a safe space for people to share their workplace horror stories. So I did. I named it Voices Unmuted. Within a month, it had thousands of followers. Stories poured in, some from women, some from men, some from people who had never told a soul what they had endured. Reading their pain filled me with rage, but also with purpose. I started hiring moderators and writers, people who could help manage the growing community. We added legal resources, counseling contacts, templates for filing complaints. We became a shield for those too scared to speak alone. But just when things were looking bright, something dark came crawling back. John. He resurfaced online using a fake name. He started posting on forums claiming he was innocent, that he was the real victim, that I had destroyed his life for fame. He even found a small group of supporters who believed him. They spread lies, said I doctored evidence, said Rachel was paid, said the other victims were actors. The comments were filled with poison, and yet I did not flinch. I had seen this tactic before. Deny, deflect, attack, but truth does not need a disguise. I wrote a post addressing every lie. I laid out facts. I showed receipts. I spoke with calm and fire. The support that followed was overwhelming. People began defending me before I even spoke. That is when I realized I was no longer alone in this fight. Then came the biggest shock. A former board member contacted me. She said she had retired quietly after trying to expose John years ago, but no one listened to her. She had documents, internal letters, meeting transcripts. She sent them to Rachel anonymously. They proved that executives had known about John's behavior for years and did nothing. Rachel published a third article. This one exploded like wildfire. Lawsuits rained on the company. New leadership was demanded. The CEO resigned. HR heads were replaced. Policies rewritten. All because people stopped being silent. And in the middle of all of it, there I was. Just a woman who once got fired for saying no. With every article and every voice that joined the movement, my strength grew. I no longer needed validation. I no longer cared what people whispered. I was building something bigger than revenge. I was rebuilding power from the ground up. The kind of power that does not exploit but protects. One evening, I was invited to speak at a university. A law school to be exact. Future lawyers filled the seats. They wanted to hear my story, not as gossip, but as a case study in justice and resistance. I stood in front of them and said, I am not here because I am special. I am here because someone tried to silence me and failed. After the event, a professor approached me. She said she had been following my case. She offered to help take voices unmuted to the next level. She introduced me to people in nonprofit law, people who could help me register the platform as a legal advocacy foundation. I said yes without hesitation. Weeks later, Voices Unmuted became a registered organization. We received our first grant, enough to hire a small team full-time. Former victims, survivors, fighters, people who understood pain, not as a weakness, but as a weapon. We created programs, held workshops, gave legal aid to workers across the country. But John was still lurking. One day I found out he had applied to a new job at another firm under a slightly altered name. Someone from that firm recognized his face and messaged me. I reached out to them, sent the full file of evidence. They fired him before he even started. He tried again and again, every time someone tipped me off. Every time I stopped him, not out of spite, but to protect the next girl who might walk into his office thinking hard work is enough. I had become his shadow, a reminder that what he did would follow him forever. Then something happened that caught me off guard. One of his relatives reached out, a niece. She said she had seen everything unfold and wanted to apologize. She said her family disowned him, that he was living in a small town now, alone and bitter. I felt nothing, not pity, not joy, just nothing, because this was never about watching him suffer. This was about making sure no one else would. His downfall was just the beginning. The real victory was the change, the ripple effect, the voices that refused to die, the hands that reached for each other in dark rooms and found light. Rachel continued publishing stories. Voices Unmuted kept growing. I was offered a book deal. I declined. I did not want to be a brand. I wanted to be a bridge. For others. For those still trapped in offices where monsters wear ties and smiles. And I knew deep down that my journey was far from over. Months passed, and the world began to shift in small but powerful ways. Companies started re-evaluating their internal systems. HR departments began mandatory reforms. More employees spoke up. The phrase workplace safety was no longer just about physical spaces, but emotional and psychological ones too. I was invited to sit on a panel with labor reform advocates and legal experts. They wanted to talk about how one voice became many and how one story ignited policy. I listened as experts cited my case, my evidence, my fire, and yet I still did not feel like a hero. I felt like a survivor, carrying stories that were never mine alone. Rachel received an award for investigative journalism. and she invited me to the stage with her. She said this award belongs to every woman who stood when the world asked her to kneel. I held her hand and looked at the crowd, a room filled with cameras and applause. But all I could think of were the nights. I cried alone, wondering if I had made a mistake by speaking out. But there were no mistakes, only scars that taught me how to fight better. One day I received a message from a girl named Tina. She was 19, working part-time at a firm in another state. Her story was mine in a different uniform. A boss, a room, a threat. She had read my blog. She had found courage. She recorded everything, sent it to HR, filed a complaint, and they listened. Because the world was watching now. I cried reading her message, not out of sadness, but because I knew the war I fought had saved someone else. That was my justice. That was my reward. A stranger who never had to fall because I did. Voices Unmuted was invited to partner with national advocacy networks. We built an app where workers could report abuse safely and anonymously. It connected them to legal teams, volunteers, and support groups. We used technology to do what policies had failed to do for decades. John tried one last time to discredit me. He paid a blogger to write a smear piece. The article lasted online for 20 minutes before it was taken down. People flooded the site with comments. Screenshots were shared, and the blogger issued a public apology. The attempt backfired, again. Every time he tried to stand up, the world reminded him what he had done. And I did not have to lift a single finger. That is what happens when truth walks ahead of you. It clears the path before you even arrive. Eventually, I stopped thinking about him, not out of forgiveness, but because he was no longer worth the space in my mind. I had too many battles to fight, too many people to lift, too many futures to protect. The girl who was fired had become a name that opened doors for others. I visited my old office building one day, not to confront, but to remember. I stood across the street, watching people walk in, and out dressed in suits, carrying coffee lost in deadlines. I wondered if they knew what had happened there, if they felt safer now, if the walls still whispered the things they once witnessed and buried. I walked around the block and found the coffee shop where I used to take my lunch breaks. The barista recognized me. He said, "I saw your story on the news, you were brave." I smiled and said I was just tired of being afraid. He nodded and gave me my coffee for free, a small gesture that felt bigger than any headline. I sat by the window and watched the world move. It felt surreal, how pain can live in places, and yet time keeps pushing forward. I thought about who I was before all this, a woman who believed in hard work, who trusted the system, who thought saying no would be enough. I wanted to reach back in time and hug her, tell her she would be okay, that the fire would not destroy her, but shape her. Later that week, I attended a conference where lawmakers discussed workplace harassment legislation. They mentioned our platform. They said it had shifted public pressure and created accountability in spaces where fear once ruled. I was invited to speak. I walked to the podium with calm steps and a louder heart. I told them policy without protection is just paper, that until women and men can speak without risking their lives or jobs, we are not truly safe. The room stood in silence, not because they disagreed, but because the truth is often uncomfortable and necessary. Afterward, a young intern approached me. She said I used to think people like you only existed in movies. I told her no, I exist in every woman who says enough and every man who listens and stands. Beside her, her eyes filled with tears, and she thanked me. That moment meant more than any award. Rachel continued her work, uncovering stories others buried. She became a leader in investigative journalism. Olivia started her own podcast sharing workplace stories and educating people on red flags. Clara got promoted and became the head of HR. The change we demanded had started to spread, but the battle was never just about one office or one man. It was about a culture, a mindset, a deep-rooted belief that power gives permission. We were tearing down that belief, one story at a time. And I had learned something important. That healing is not linear. Some days I still woke up shaking. Some nights I still heard his voice in my sleep. But I no longer let fear sit at the table. I let courage lead now, because silence was no longer my language. Years passed, and my life took a shape I never expected. Voices Unmuted had grown into a national movement. We had offices in multiple cities. We trained leaders, held seminars, partnered with universities and businesses. What started as my scream for justice had become a network of unbreakable echoes. I was invited to Washington to speak before a congressional committee. They were reviewing a new workplace protection bill and wanted first-hand accounts. I walked into that chamber not as a victim, but as a force. I told them that silence is not consent and fear is not loyalty. That systems must be built around people, not profits. The room listened, not because I shouted, but because truth has its own volume. My voice was steady, but behind it were thousands more. Every word I spoke carried their stories. Every pause held their pain. When I finished, the committee chair stood and thanked me for my courage. But I did not feel brave. I just felt necessary. After the hearing, a senator approached me. She said her daughter had followed my story, that she felt empowered to speak up about her own experience at her college. I felt the tears rising, but I held them, not out of pride, but because I knew the ripple was working. One voice was becoming waves. John had vanished from the headlines. He was no longer a threat, just a lesson, a warning. He lived in obscurity now, a man stripped of power and relevance. I did not celebrate his fall. I simply refused to mourn his absence. He had taken enough from the world. I would not give him more. Rachel started a foundation in her name. She trained young journalists on how to report sensitive stories. Clara restructured the HR system at her firm, and now travels speaking about transparency and justice. Olivia wrote a book about her experience. It became a bestseller. We had all grown, not in spite of what happened, but because we refused to let it define us. One morning, I walked past a bookstore and saw a display titled, "Women Who Changed the Workplace." My face was on one of the covers. I stood there for a long time staring, not because I saw a hero, but because I saw a woman who once stood in front of a closed door and chose not to walk away. I received a letter that same day from a high school girl. She had been harassed by a teacher, and no one believed her. She read my story and recorded everything. Her teacher was removed. She wrote, "Thank you for saving a girl you have never met." I folded the letter and placed it in a box filled with similar letters. I kept them all, not for ego, but for those nights when the weight returned. When the past tried to creep back in, they reminded me why I never gave up. Because I had learned something the hard way. That truth is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, consistent, patient, but it never stops. And neither did I. I stood at the edge of a quiet lake one evening, watching the water ripple under the soft wind. My phone was off. No meetings, no emails, no noise, just silence. The kind that feels like peace, not fear. The kind I fought years to earn. I closed my eyes and remembered the girl who once lost everything in a single morning. Fired. Humiliated, terrified. But she stood back up. Brick by brick, she rebuilt her voice. I had traveled across the country by then, spoken in rooms filled with power and pain. I had watched survivors transform into leaders, watched companies bend under pressure and rise with better purpose. I had seen the ugly exposed and the brave celebrated, and I knew deep in my heart that change was not an idea anymore. It was a reality. One of our newest projects was building an international coalition to unite workers from different countries under one support system. We were planning to launch the first global summit on workplace ethics, and they asked me to deliver the keynote speech. I said yes, because if my voice could travel this far, then why stop now? On the night of the summit, I stood backstage, looking at the lights and cameras. My hands trembled for the first time in months, not from fear, but from pride. I had not chased fame. I chased justice, and it led me here. The music faded. My name was called. I walked onto the stage with steady feet. The applause echoed around me, but I waited until it stopped. Then I spoke. I told them about Melissa, the woman who got fired for saying no, the woman who had no power, no allies, no plan, just truth, and how that truth refused to be buried. I told them about the pain, the fight, the walls I had to break, and the bridges we built after the dust settled. The room was quiet. Some cried. Some held hands. Some stood without a word. I ended by saying, "This is not my story alone. It belongs to every voice that once whispered, and now dares to shout." The room rose to its feet. Not for me, but for all of us. After the summit, I walked outside into the night. The air was cool, the sky clear. I looked up and whispered thank you, not to anyone in particular, just to the universe for letting me survive, for giving me the strength to choose my voice over my fear. John had become a ghost by then, mentioned only as a warning in lectures and articles. His story ended long ago, but mine kept going, not as a tale of revenge, but as a revolution that never asked for permission. And as I walked away from the stage into the quiet of my own life, I smiled, because I knew the fire that once tried to consume me had become the light that guided others home.